Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll get started in just a few moments. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Alexis Silvera. I am CAPGA's Communications Director. Thank you for joining CAPGA's Member Regulation webinar. We have an extremely informative agenda for you today. Our advocacy updates will begin with a presentation from Ruth Ann Anderson, President and CEO of CAPGA, regarding certification and training. Following that, you'll hear from CAPGA's Technology and Innovation Director, Patrick Dozier, regarding some exciting news surrounding CE hours reported. And to close this section, CAPGA's lobbyist, Taylor Roshan, will provide us with the latest updates on neonicotinoids and 1,3-D. Please utilize the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen during the presentations. We'll have a moderated Q&A opportunity following these presentations. Lastly, you'll hear from Christelle Turlo, our Chief Operations Director, regarding the latest member benefits and opportunities to stay informed. This webinar is being recorded and will be provided to our entire membership via the newsletter next week. Again, thank you for joining us. We'll now move over to our first speaker, Ruth Ann Anderson.
Thanks, Alexis, and thank you to our members for taking a little bit of time out of your day to join us. We at CAPGA have been thinking about how to push out news and information in a much clearer way to our membership, and we hope that this is just another opportunity to be able to connect with you during your workday. One of the biggest things that's coming forward in 2024 is changes to certification and training for pesticide handlers. This is a federal change that was triggered about 4 to 5 years ago, and each state was responsible to interpret the changes from the federal document and roll out their own regulations. California has chosen January 1, 2024 for our unique compliance date. There's a link there for the full regulation package, and I'm sure we'll include that in the newsletter as well. The things that I want to highlight in C&T that I think are most appropriate, there's approximately 30 pages of edits within the Food and Ag Code for C&T, but some of the broad changes are for your growers. Their private applicator certificate, or PAC, is going to sunset at the end of their current renewal cycle. So over the next 3 years, 2024, 2025, and 2026 renewals will all require retesting, and retesting with a new exam that's been kind of provided in this rollout. If you can go to the next slide, if you have a PAC and you are also doing any type of fumigation, there is a new subcategory for the PAC, the burrowing vertebrate pest fumigation certification, and the details are there on your screen. But in order to apply for that subcategory under your PAC, you do need to retest early, even if you don't need to cycle into retesting until one of the later dates. So something to reach out to your ag commissioner and verify with your county, not only testing dates, but process to make sure that you're in compliance for January 1. So obviously the PAC kind of shift is around not only compliance, but also fumigation. And we see that also with QALs and QACs in the C&T. So the next slide, you'll see that for all fumigant subcategories on the QAL and QAC license, they will sunset at the end of this year. And the state is shifting to 2 categories, one of them being a soil, the other being a non-soil fumigant category. If you haven't already seen this, I would encourage you to scan in and make sure that you are accessing the new study guides, as well as submitting a request for an exam. We know that currently, depending on the test location, it can be anywhere up to 6 weeks between the time that you apply and the open date for an exam. And so we really want to get the word out and prioritize this for any of our members that are impacted so that they can stay professionally compliant headed into the new year. Again, your current fumigant categories on any QAL, QAC license would sunset at the end of this year, regardless of whether or not you're renewing. The last kind of piece with CNT that has been a real focus for CAPCA is the continuing education. There's some broad changes here that we've outlined. Some of the big highlights in the change are time and attention in a course, a sponsor, really recording the time that an attendee is in the course, limiting a course application to 8 hours a day, and then limiting the type of presentations during a course. So there are now limits on things like panels, question and answer sessions, as well as the exhibit hall, otherwise in regulation known as vendor displays. Those are all limited to 30 minutes maximum, not each, but maximum for one course that has to have a minimum of 4 hours of additional education kind of programmed together. So you may see some changes in 2024 to the program offerings of your sponsors, including CAPCA, in order to comply with these new regulations. Another thing that you might see is Online CE has some very specific requirements now in terms of stopping the progression of a program if someone's unresponsive, as well as both quiz and exams being a little bit more clearly defined in terms of expectation in the code. And so I think, CAPCA has spent the last few years, recognizing that a lot of these big changes were coming and wondering, how do we continue to serve our members well and provide not only great hours tracking, but to support quality education, whether you're taking your courses through CAPCA or our chapters or through another sponsor. And the biggest kind of change in this that has triggered a lot of internal discussions is that starting on January 1, DPR would like all CE hours reported directly to them. And so I am going to kind of pass the discussion over to Patrick Dozier, our Technology and Innovations Director, to talk about where this conversation has landed and some exciting things that we're going to be bringing forward in 2024 to solve the problem that's been presented here.
Thank you, Ruthann. And if we may go to the next slide. Happy to see everybody here today. So with these new regulations around specifically the changes to CE reporting, CAPCA's board's view was that we needed to modernize our attendance tracking and reporting system. And we wanted to take the lead on that and make sure that it's something that CAPCA has total control over. We know that hours tracking is one of the most important things that we do for our members, and we want to make sure that we can ensure high quality hour tracking in 2024 and beyond. On the screen here, you can see a message that's a little bit directed at sponsors. The changes to the C and T changes that come to CE really impact the sponsors the most and how they're going to comply. So Ruthann already mentioned some of them, but some of the changes that are pretty material to sponsors is that a CE sponsor must report directly to DPR and within 14 calendar days of them completing a course, not 14 business days. Another major change is that sponsors must track and report actual hours. That's in and out of a course, including breaks and including people that are late arrivals and early departures. And even one is including a speaker may not receive hours for while they are speaking. And so the regulations require that a sponsor must have a system in place to track all that. And that applies to all license types and certificate types. And now that also includes the private applicator certificates. Private applicators need to have that detailed tracking. And finally, one of the things that a sponsor must do is provide all attendees with a verification of attendance with their actual hours awarded, calculated, and filled out by the sponsor. So the blank VOA template is not acceptable anymore. So that's actually quite a bit. If you're a meeting sponsor, you're aware maybe those are some major changes. If you're an attendee, maybe that doesn't all make sense, but it's going to make it a lot harder for a sponsor to use the current system. So we propose a new system. That's what CE hours reported is. And so years ago, CAPCA started the CE hours reported trademark as a sign that these are the sponsors that are reliably tracking your hours and reporting them to DPR and making sure your hours are tracked for you at capca.com. Well, we took CE hours reported and we're building cereported.com, which you can see the logo there, or you can scan this QR code to go to cereported.com and get signed up. Excuse me. And there, for both sponsors and attendees can sign up. We'll streamline the CE course application process for sponsors, making sure you're compliant with all the new regulations and the latest changes to regulations. We will make it easy to track all attendees in and out for accurate hours reporting. We will be using a QR code system, very similar to like when you get on a flight these days. If you use your digital boarding pass, an attendee, a PCA, will get out their phone and have a QR code that's unique to them if they have an account with us. And the sponsor will use their device, their phone or another device, to scan your QR code and get you in and out. And using that system will circumvent the need for ID checks, signatures, etc. It'll also accept anybody that shows up on site and doesn't have an account with CE hours reported. They'll be able to get checked in manually through the software. A big value for the sponsors is that it'll then automate the reporting to DPR on the back end, accurate hours. It'll calculate them. It'll allow them to edit the record in case there's a discrepancy, like somebody missed a check-in, check-out. It'll be easy for them to adjust the record and then create verifications of attendance for every single attendee and send them. And there's a lot more. So again, we're building this right now. We started software development in early August, and we are on track to launch this ahead of the new regulations in January. Right now, we're looking for some sponsors to engage with us and to pilot, kind of look and test at the current system and to get their feedback. So whether you're an attendee or a sponsor, I encourage you to go to cereported.com and get on our wait list. And that's all I got today. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. We'll now move over to Taylor Roshan.
Well, good morning, everyone. Taylor Roshan. I'm one of the government affairs advocates here in Sacramento, representing CAPCA. And it's been a very busy year with C&T and other actions by DPR and our friends at US EPA, along with the legislature. So I'm going to go over some of the regulatory actions that have been recently finalized, and then another that's pending, and then do a quick overview of some legislation of note this year, and then there may be a few extra pieces we can have some discussion about. So Alexis is just going to share my screen. Great, and thank you so much for having me. Next slide. So we have come to conclusion this year on a very long-standing regulatory update on neonics. And I want to be specific, this is ag-specific neonics. There was a reevaluation that was initiated in 2009 based on concerns about impacts of neonic use on pollinators in agricultural settings. That process took quite a long time. As you can tell from 2009 to 2022, there were addendums that were made. There was a secondary risk determination that was made. And there were studies that needed to be conducted on potential impacts to bees. And that's the impetus behind the regulation. So through a series of iterations, DPR finalized their regulations a few months ago, and those are set to become effective January 1, 2024. And I just want to note, because we're going to touch on it later, this is specific to agricultural use of neonicotinoids. So generally speaking, the regulations, which I would encourage you all to view the actual regulations, it's not a long document, and it's in fairly understandable terms. The department has proposed to divide agricultural commodities that are using neonics into 16 different crop categories. This is something that's been conducted on the federal level in previous regulatory packages. And then within those 16 crop categories, they've tiered them based on the crop's attractiveness to bees. So the more attractive that the commodity may or may not be during bloom, the more restrictive the standards are versus those that are moderate to no attraction to bees, have no or very less restrictions. The restrictions, as you can see from the slide, are the final 3 items. There are maximum application rates, both for individual applications and then seasonal applications rates. And there is application rate maximums that are applied to both soil and foliar application. There's also restriction for 1 active ingredient neonic per season, whereas before you might be able to toggle between 4 different individual neonic products. You would now, under this regulation, be required to utilize only 1 for the duration of the season. And so as a part of your relationship with CAPCA and part of my job to best represent all of you and your interests at DPR, if you're seeing issues like pest resistance that you would otherwise not have if you were to be able to rotate through chemistries, please let CAPCA know. It's the information and feedback on implementation is incredibly important. Yes, this regulation is final, but amendments are possible if we continue to see problems.
And I think, Taylor, maybe just to jump in on the implementation piece, enforcement is obviously going to be a really complex piece. And that's been something that Taylor and I have talked a lot about over the last year with key stakeholders of, how is this enforced? What does this look like? And really where we've landed is this is a post-action enforcement. And we've been talking with not only the manufacturers, but a few of the rec writing systems to discuss, how do we build out some really easy features that will help our members to be able to comply with this in terms of tracking and watching, not only that per application rate, but those season caps, documenting end of season, all of those types of things are going to be important kind of moving into the new year. I did want to just jump in and clarify, because I know that this is a question that I've gotten often from members in just individual conversations. The regulation does start on January 1, 2024. And so if there are any, we'll call them either pre or mid-season applications that would have bridged into the new year, as long as it was applied before January 1, 2024, it does not need to be included in your season tracking, but anything that's applied starting January 1 needs to be included in kind of this regulatory compliance piece.
Great, thanks, Ruth Ann. And the last piece I just want to note in the general restrictions is there is a prohibition on application during the bloom season. So DPR has defined that from flowering to petal fall. That's going to vary dramatically based on crop type, as many of you know, and based on annuals versus perennials. So you may have multiple seasons with bloom. There may be habitually blooming commodities as well. And so working with your growers and letting them know so you can come up with a game plan will be incredibly important. And then, as in all, there's exemptions to these provisions for things like Section 18s, quarantine pests, research, and then enclosed structures. And I would imagine the enclosed structures would be things like in the nursery setting or for citrus, where you may be in an ACP HOB quarantine zone. Next slide. And on the citrus note, I just felt like it was appropriate for you all to see what an example of the complexity of implementing this regulation would look like starting Jan 1. So this is what the conditions would be in place for citrus fruit and that crop category. On the left-hand side, you see columns governing the active ingredients with 4 different active ingredients listed, the maximum application rates for both soil and foliar applications, and the timing of the application. This is particularly around the prohibitions during bloom. And then in addition, on the right-hand side, you'll see just the general standing that there's a prohibition during bloom. And then there is a combined application limit if you're using both soil and foliar applications at about 0.5 pound per AI per acre per season. Okay, next slide. A secondary regulatory update we wanted to inform you all on was on 1,3-D or Talone. It's a pre-plant soil fumigant for a variety of commodities for nematode management, among other things. The history in this is there's certainly been a lot of attention and focus on fumigants by DPR as of late. But in 2018, the state has a series of air monitoring systems as a part of a network across California, predominantly in the Central Valley. And on one of those air monitorings in 2018, there was an exceedance of DPR screening levels by 1 part per billion over the existing limit that DPR had. And, it's the law that we have to live by, but just to put it in context, I think DPR's limit is almost 100 times less stringent than the federal limit. So California certainly has greater stringency, but regardless, there was a single exceedance. I believe it was in Parlier. And that was the impetus for the department to initiate rulemaking. So they began a rulemaking package on 1,3-D. As a part of it, they understood that they can't dramatically disrupt existing agricultural systems and necessity for managing soil issues. And so in 2020, they initiated a pilot program where they looked with the assistance of industry, where they looked to evaluate different methodologies that they could do, like deeper injection, soil moisture, as ways to reduce the emissions that are associated with fumigation, but still provide the efficacy that's needed. And these pilot actions were incorporated into the rulemaking, which was initiated in 2022 in January, but has not yet been finalized. There's also pending litigation. If you all may remember the history on it, and I'm not an attorney, so I'll have to caveat that, but those in our office certainly are and have been working on this case, among others. 1,3-D had operated under a township cap on limited use per township. And a total use per township. That was a part of a previous lawsuit that obligated that. Then there was action that invalidated the point of a township cap. So the township cap was removed. And then stepping into the regulation, it does incorporate the removal of the township cap. So we'll go over some of that. Alexis, do you want to go to the next slide? Great. So here's a side-by-side of what the current standards are and what the proposed regulations are. There's certainly more to it. So I would encourage you to also review the regulation if you're active in the fumigant space. As I mentioned, currently there is a township cap of 136,000 pounds per year. And it is on the registrants to report that information of how much is being sold and utilized in those areas. There's some setback restrictions, maximum application rates, a time prohibition. So nothing can occur in December. And then there are some minimum soil moisture requirements for a condition of use. What the department has proposed, and I want to make clear, this is proposed, so it can still be modified. They had previous language that was modified, I want to say in the summer of this year. And so that could happen again, where there could be further amendments to this. So this is all tentative until it's final. It removes the township cap, as I had mentioned, due to litigation. It has increased the setback limits, but there are particular conditions around setbacks 100 to 500 feet for an extended period of time, multiple time between applications. And so I'd really encourage you to look at what that setback standard is for your particular commodities. The maximum application rate has remained the same, but a new requirement is the obligation to have totally impermeable film tarps, so TIF tarps. Those would be required as a condition of application. The prohibition on application timing has expanded March to October and November to February. And there's also an obligation for greater soil moisture. So we kicked up the soil moisture about 50%. And then there's an obligation to irrigate 3 inches 2 days to 3 days before. And then there is an obligation for applicators to do a soil moisture test. And there's a variation on how that might be done with a soil moisture probe, or they call it a hand smear test. And then lastly, as a part of the pilot program and the projects that were conducted in 2020, one of the recommendations in the regulation is to incorporate injection depth as a condition to minimize emissions that are coming off the field post-fumigation. So there would be a requirement in some circumstances to have 24 to 18-inch injection sites that's combined with tarping and soil moisture. So once again, there are more specifics based on trees and vines or other row crops. And so you'll want to take a look at the regulation as proposed just to get a feel for it before and if it's finalized in this form. All right, so as I had mentioned, in addition to being a heavy regulatory year, this was a very heavy legislative year for pesticides, pest management issues. I've listed some of the high-profile bills. I'll start with the good news, I suppose. 2 of the bills that have failed this year. California has a 2-year legislative session, so we just closed out year 1 of the 2-year session, which means when I say failed, they failed for this year. These bills can be and will likely be reinitiated next year in their same positions, or they'll modify a new bill with this. So 2 bills that failed this year were AB 1042 and AB 99. 1042 would have banned the use of seeds that are treated with pesticides coming in from out of state, and if those pesticides are not registered for use in California. And so we've been doing a little bit of work with the seed associations and others to understand the extent to which this is occurring. The sponsors and authors felt as though this was a loophole where you've got unregistered product that may or may not be present in California. But in addition to that, it would have required all treated seeds, even if that treatment occurred in California or with a state registered product, to be regulated, the seeds themselves to be regulated in the same manner as pesticides, which means DPR would have to set up a registration structure, labeling standards, reevaluation, evaluation, risk determination. The entirety of DPR structure would be placed on top of seeds, and that's in addition to the California seed law, which is governed by the Department of Food and Agriculture. There were obviously lots of conversations about the agronomic benefits of seeds, the climate benefits, the resource constraints, but there was a perspective from the sponsors and authors about leaching, wildlife exposure, and DPR has stated in a workshop that they have a strong interest. And so conversations are happening between DPR and others in the interim to see what kind of information DPR would need that would be able to ward off future legislation like this. Another bill that failed was AB 99. That was a prohibition on Caltrans using synthetic pesticides and even organic pesticides as well. So that bill failed really because Caltrans said, we can't possibly do this. We have so much vegetation to manage, and there are serious public safety and wildfire risks if we don't use the science-based efficacious tools that we have. Another bill which is pending, but we imagine the governor will likely veto, is AB 1322. This bill would prohibit the use of difecinone. This is a first-generation anticoagulant or rodenticide in California. There are some applications of difecinone in agricultural settings for things like ground squirrels and orchards. So the bill would make it a restricted material and actually obligate it to go through reevaluation, but have some interim bans. And then it would also require, as a part of that reevaluation, for the Department of Fish and Wildlife to concur with DPR's decisions on their risk assessment and reevaluation. Fish and Wildlife's concurrence would open a brand new precedent for Fish and Wildlife to concur on nearly every reevaluation that DPR conducts, regardless of the product. That's what I think our larger fear is. And then most certainly there are real structural pest problems that are associated with banning a softer chemistry like diphacinone. So we do expect the governor to veto that. And then two bills that unfortunately we expect the governor to sign is AB 363 and AB 652. AB 652 would create an environmental justice advisory committee at DPR made up of certainly environmental justice advocates, farm worker advocates, socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers advocates. I believe there's this role for an agroecologist and a tribal representative. At the end of session, the bill was narrowed a bit more to speak to the fact that the EJAC committee could not make recommendations outside of DPR's authority. So they couldn't go ask DPR to create brand new programs and be subject to new standards. But what we've seen when we've seen other EJACs at other agencies and departments is just the time and resource constraint that goes into facilitating these meetings. They come at relatively large expense. CARB's EJAC is about $2 million a year, along with per diem for the employee or for the participants. And then there's just, when there's a regulatory hearing, the EJAC hearing has to predate that. And so it just adds timelines on and some constraints. And then there are concerns that a committee such as this can get into pushing for reevaluations on products the department wasn't prepared for, or halting registrations or research projects that they would not look at favorably. But we do expect the governor to sign that bill. And then lastly, because I pushed so hard in our regulatory update on these are around ag-based neonics, understandably, some folks in the legislature said, hey, what about non-ag neonics? And so this year we saw a bill, AB 363, which is around non-ag based neonic use. And this bill would prohibit the use of neonics unless by a certified applicator in a residential or commercial setting. And then it would obligate the department to do a series of reevaluations and risk assessments. The first reevaluation would be on imidacloprid specifically, and then secondary reevaluation would be on the remainder within the neonic category. And then there would be an obligation that by 2029, based on the information from those reevaluations, the department would initiate control measures, which could mean additional restrictions, mitigations, licensing obligations, and things like that for residential settings. I think CAPCA and our industry partners have been really concerned about this because it is a paradigm of ban first, study second, which is not something that DPR's system, which is risk-based and science-based, has facilitated. Ruth Ann, do you want to share a little bit more about CAPCA's perspective on this bill or others?
Yeah, or maybe we can just tie it together with the Sustainable Pest Management Roadmap. And, when that was released over the winter, there was kind of, we'll say like a hand that was shown that, there was a recommitment to some science being involved in these discussions. And, really the force was that there would be reevaluation before banning new products. And so it's been kind of a little bit of an about face and some confusion, amongst the ag stakeholders, including CAPCA, on, what the true intention of SPM is and where that's going to evolve. And I do see it's kind of in your upcoming piece there. So maybe that's a good transition for us to talk a little bit about SPM. Sure,
absolutely. And we did want to share just a few things that are up and coming, and we can speak to more on the mill proposal by DPR and the Sustainable Pest Management Work Group Roadmap and its impacts. So first, maybe we'll start with the mill, Ruth Ann, if that works. There will be a proposal. Some of you may have the history on it. The mill was last updated 2003, I want to say, so almost 20 years ago. But with that said, it has an inflationary component. So because the mill is assessed on a dollar value, as the value of the dollar increases, the value of the mill increases in the aggregate. So DPR 2 years ago initiated a proposal with the legislature to tier the mill. So as of now, the mill is assessed on a flat rate, regardless of a product's toxicity or expanded use. And so they had proposed to tier it based on toxicity. There were a whole host of problems with what that may or may not look like. And I think DPR made a major concession to speak to the fact that if they want to push sustainable pest management, and if in their mind that means using less toxic products, that leaves, and if less toxic products are charged a higher mill rate and 80% of the department's budget is dependent upon mill, that puts the department in a serious funding crunch moving forward. So if you look at the projection, they would have serious revenue shortage. And so that proposal was scrapped, but in the interim, the legislature gave DPR funds to do what they would call an independent study on what would be alternative proposals. So in the current mill, it's set at 21 mils, and that's 0.02 cents on the dollar for every dollar sale of pesticide in California. Ag does pay a very small additional mill in addition to that 21. The total value of the mill in 2022, I believe, was almost 95 million. And as I mentioned, it's a significant portion of DPR's budget. It is a flat rate, so the cap is set in statute, the maximum assessed rate is set in statute, and then the actual assessed rate is set in regulations. But as I mentioned, it does have an inflationary component. So even if it's remained at 21 mils, it's gone from $60 million 10 years ago to $95 million now. And then during the pandemic, they had a few bumper years, I would say, because there was a significant purchasing of antimicrobials and sanitizers, which are pesticidal materials. And bear in mind, ag products are one half, and home and consumer and commercial products are the other half of the mill. So in that independent study that DPR financed, the proposal would be to maintain a flat rate in the same manner that we have, but to increase the mill from 21 to 33. And then very modestly increase the ag-specific mill. That would be, however, a 57% increase on the total mill that is assessed. It would provide a 30% increase or more to DPR's budget. So they'd go from almost 95 million to almost 150 million, which would mean that 90% of the department's budget, rather than 80, is predicated on mill funds. And then the concept would be to phase in that mill increase over time to lessen the impact on the user community. But I think the more concerning thing in the long term is that the study suggested in 5 years, once you fully phased in from 21 to 33 mils, to evaluate whether tiering is appropriate. The department is proposing in the Sustainable Pest Management Roadmap to have a pesticide prioritization committee. And that committee would look at what types of pesticides or active ingredients does the department and I suppose the public want to move away from. And in that process, they'll look at the availability of alternatives. What are the financial necessities of that particular product for different commodities? And it would identify a short list of products and classes of pesticides that would be specified as priority. I think we should prepare for fumigants, organophosphates, and others to be included in that first year short list. And then this study suggests that in year 5 of the mill implementation, they can have a discussion about potentially raising mill assessment on those particular priority pesticides as a stick approach to dissuade use of those products. Ruth Ann, you want to add? Please.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and clarify, the mill doesn't just fund DPR's budget, but also is a very significant background or backbone to the county ag commissioner system and programs. So enforcement, inspections, etc. And I think, you know, one of the things that you and I have talked extensively about is we'll say kind of an expansion or a creep within some of the mill proposal language of assigning more and more to the commissioners outside of that inspection and enforcement space, and even within the department. So, you know, is the role or the funding source for some of these programs really supposed to be general fund out of the state of California's budget, or, you know, should it be pulled from mill, which, you know, has a historical intention of really being the industry paying for their own enforcement and oversight. And so I think these discussions are going to be very interesting and complex as we move into the new year, recognizing that some of the areas of expansion and the priorities that the department wants to see have been put forward in their strategic plan that was released this last month. But again, you know, questions are still swirling of who's responsible. Is it the responsibility of industry? Does it fit into enforcement? Things like community outreach and language access, or are those really general fund pieces? Because, you know, these are broadly requests by the community and the citizens of California.
Yeah, great point, Ruthann. Maybe we can switch to the final slide for me. So one other project we just wanted to give you an update on was pesticide use notification. Some of you may be in the Kern County area and be familiar with the history around this proposal. There is a program at the state called AB 617, their community emission reduction plans. So the Air Resources Board selects communities throughout California annually to conduct their own community emission reduction plan and make a series of recommendations that are associated with that. There has been a significant push in the Central Valley from AB 617 communities around the VOCs, volatile organic compounds that are associated with pesticide applications. And what happened is the AB 617 community made a recommendation that anytime a pesticide application is occurring in the community, there should be advance notice to members of the public. And so that individual 617 community in Kern County pushed for that. They pushed the agricultural commissioner in the area to implement that. The agricultural commissioner said, I don't answer to 617. I don't answer to the Air Resources Board. I'm answerable to my county, and I take direction with discretion from the Department of Pesticide Regulation and the Department of Food and Agriculture. And so there was a lot of frustration from the environmental justice community that went back to the Air Resources Board and the Department of Pesticide Regulation. As, I suppose, a relief valve, what happened is the state provided funding last year in the state budget, $10 million for the Department of Pesticide Regulation to do a statewide notification. So rather than having these individual counties get pressured to do notification, DPR said, we'll do a statewide approach. In 2022, they did a series of county pilot projects in Stanislaus, Riverside, Santa Cruz, and Ventura County. The idea was to model different methods of notification, of which types of products would be subject to this. What are different ways that we inform the public? Is it something that's on a website? Do you sign up for a text alert? And so those 4 counties volunteered to be a part of that process. And they informed what would be a statewide project. Now, I want to be clear, and we've had many conversations with the department and legislators around pesticide use notification, specifically around the framing that this is not a warning. Notification is not provided so that you can go and take greater health protective actions, because the department's registration process and reevaluation and the ag commissioner's role, and many of you as educated licensees facilitate the safest approach to an application. And so really this is simply what they term as a right to know proposal, not a warning, but we should prepare for people to misinterpret information for those that are so inclined. As of now, what we understand the statewide system to look like is to only include restricted materials. While there's certainly a push to include all materials by folks outside of our coalition, I think the department has a serious issue in going wider because they don't have systems like notices of intent that are present for restricted materials to be able to facilitate that advance notice. They are proposing to provide notice of an application for anyone within a mile radius. So if you look at the graph on the left-hand side, it has a 1 block or a 1 mile radius within each of these yellow squares. You could have an application site in the pink, and then the user would be the house in the very middle. So you would be notified if you were a resident in the house, you would go on a system, put this is where I'm located at, and then anywhere within that 1 mile radius, you would be getting information about an application that would be occurring for you. As of now, the department is proposing to provide 24-hour notice in advance of restricted use materials, and then 48 hours of notice for fumigants. This runs an incredibly tight timeline for notices of intent to be submitted to ag commissioners to process that into a system. And so as you can imagine, there may be, and we should expect an impact on those of you that submit paper NOIs. Submission of a paper NOI would mean the ag commissioner needs to go in and digitize that NOI in some way to feed it into a computer system so that they could report out within the 24-hour timeline. And so you may or may not see a regulation coming forward that prohibits the use of paper NOIs or puts more standards on the submission of paper NOIs. Within the notice as well, they are proposing to include the particular product that's applied, linking to safety data sheets or product labels, identifying the general date and time of the application, and then other educational materials and notices within that, that document. What we've asked the department to be really considerate of is that it's going to be very challenging for people to understand that an NOI may be submitted and a product may never be applied. And so not only for those that are misinterpreting this as a health warning, they then are taking protective measures for an extended period of time when actually they don't need to, or there's a perception that during high use time periods, especially in agriculture, where you have an ag-urban interface, you're going to be seeing quite a few notes on your notification that is not actually happening on the field level. The notifications will also not include specific information about where the application is occurring within that 1 mile radius. There may be some circumstances where it's generally easy to reverse engineer where that is. Or the applicator's information. And that's really because we want to protect confidential information and proprietary information for those that are applying and those that are seeking application services. And you may or may not hear there will be significant new obligations on your county ag commissioners. For those 4 commissioners who served as the pilot sites, I know Ruth Ann and I have had multiple conversations with them of them saying they would get a middle of the night phone call from a resident who got a notice, who was terrified about what they were supposed to do. Okay, I got this notice. What am I supposed to do? And so, or they want the ag commissioner to interpret the label, which is not their role and function. And so it will be a significant workload increase for those ag commissioners where they're in high anxiety areas.
And you're right, Taylor. I mean, it's been complex kind of navigating the pilot projects. And I think, you know, even beyond the things that you noted, there's this tension of right to know within your own community, as well as out of the community. I know that a lot of the pilot projects recognize that the majority of the users were not adjacent or even within the county. And so there's some complexities as we see this roll out. I believe we should see some draft regulations next month. that will kind of give us a little bit more insight. But I want to recognize here, one of the other complexities is whether or not the commissioners will continue to have an exemption for immediate application. A lot of counties, kind of trigger this when we have a weather incident or something else that may make the application safer to apply prior to that waiting period that's triggered with a typical NOI. And so I know that from CAPCA's perspective, that is something that we want to continue to focus on. How do we make safe applications? How do we use notice and communication to continue to focus on safety out in the field? So that is something to kind of bring up. And then maybe I caught it wrong, but I believe that there is a beta testing that's going to be launched this fall in Tulare County. And we know, but it may even kind of evolve into some additional counties that would be testing we'll call it a website that's been developed by the state of California. And so that's kind of just something for everyone to be on the lookout. While we don't see this finalized until 2025, Taylor, we still have another year of not only testing, but I think conversation and feedback.
And unfortunately, just want to add, it's all a part of that feedback loop where 10 million was enough to stand up the pilots and start the initial IT system, but ongoing costs for implementation of all of these draft regulations, use notification, the SPM roadmap will all feed back into the mill discussion that we'll be having in January.
That's a great kind of tie-in. And I think with that, maybe Alexis, will hand it over to you. I know we have a few minutes if there's any final questions. We did go pretty deep on a few of those topics.
Yeah, so one question that came from our audience, and just a reminder that if you do not get your question answered, you can always reach out to the appropriate staff member or myself, and I'll direct you over there. My email is alexis@capca.com. So the first question I just wanted to ask, do we know how bloom is being defined in regard to neonics? As soon as there's one bloom in the field, this person is specifically interested in grapes and tomatoes.
Yeah, so bloom is defined as the onset of flowering until petal fall is complete. And so the department has tried to make some considerations within each of those crop categories of general timelines on when that may or may not be, but there are serious issues for things like tomatoes.
Perfect. What form of notice is being used in the 4 pilot counties?
That's a great question. Ruth Ann, do you want to go over some of those proposals?
Yeah, so the original pilots from, last year that informed the current system that is part of the beta, Riverside was a website that had kind of a 3-mile radius that they were noticing any applications within that 3 miles. So anyone could visit the website from anywhere in the world and see that general data. But again, it was a 3-mile radius that was set. Ventura and Santa Cruz and Stanislaus kind of took some different approaches. All of them were very limited in terms of the geography of the notice. Some of it was text alerts, some of it was email, some of it was logging into a system. So all of them were very focused on a little bit more of a community-based approach. However, they still, because it was a pilot program, had an open door to members of the public anywhere being able to engage. But I know specifically, I think in Santa Cruz, you could only receive the text alerts if you were part of the defined community.
Thank you. Patrick did a great job of going through and answering some of the themes we saw in the Q&As. So you can always visit the Q&As to see what has already been answered. But one question that's out there is, what do PCAs need to do to be prepared for the neonic regulation coming down in January?
I'm happy for Patrick or Taylor to chime in as well. But I think the biggest thing from CAPCA's perspective is please read the document. It's far too complex for us to kind of roll through in a 5-minute presentation, but the crop and commodity specific information is there. And then, be talking to your rec rating system if you are using a digital resource. And seeing, what rolls out. We've put in a number of requests for new features and things that we believe will be supportive in 2024. But I just want to take a moment and empower you as the user and the client to be able to reiterate that as well. Patrick, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just if people aren't familiar with what the neonic regulations are, again, it's I think we covered it well, but it's about protecting pollinators in flowering crops, that the flowers are attractive to the pollinators. It's compliance or regulation through documentation, or your compliance is to be through documentation. So you do need to read the regulations for the crop specific and active ingredient specific requirements. So there's 4 active ingredients that are affected. There's restrictions on them individually and restrictions on them in aggregate. And then you need to keep your records and be ready to present those records if you're inspected by an ag commissioner or audited by DPR, or you or your grower. And so that's generally what it is. And I would definitely recommend that you go and look. And I believe the definitions of what flowering are in the regulations. So for example, I think Taylor's helping me right now. Tomatoes, for example, we know that's a crop that's of great concern to us. To be affected by this, neonic use would only be eligible pre-plant until the 3rd leaf on the main shoot unfold. And grapes, soil application only develop to bud until bud break, and then foliar between post bloom after petal fall, or the flowers have fallen, I should say, and harvest. So that's another example. And so in our newsletter, I think we'll share the link to the regs. But again, it's crop specific, active ingredient specific. They're much like label guidelines, but it's not part of the label. So you have to read them, and you'll have to make sure that you're complying with those rates. And CAPCA is very involved in getting some of the details figured out about what it really means to comply.
Thank you, Patrick. We're reaching the end of our time here, so we'll go ahead and end the Q&A. Like I said, you can reach out to any of the staff here or myself, and I'll direct you to the correct person. But at this time, I'll turn it over to Christelle Turlow, our Chief Operations Director, to give you a little membership update. Christelle.
Hi, Alexis. Thanks. I'll keep this short and sweet since I know everyone has somewhere to go. Just a quick update that members should have received free CE that was sent out just recently, about last month. So if you have any questions about that, please feel free to reach out to myself or someone else on the team. As you've heard, we have an e-newsletter that's being sent out monthly. This webinar will be attached to that newsletter. So I ask you that you go ahead and look over the newsletter. It's really been curated to be focused on our membership and our industry. And finally, I invite you to join one of our committees. We have a few committees: Finance Committee, Advocacy Committee, Conference Committee, Technology Committee. All of those committees are currently looking for volunteers. And if you are looking for an opportunity within your chapter, please reach out to your chapter, ask what you can do to volunteer. I know all of us are excited to bring on new ideas. And so I invite you to reach out. If you need assistance, feel free to email me directly, Christelle@capca.com. You can also call the office. You can call me. But we would be happy to hear from you and make sure you're situated so your voice and your ideas and thoughts are heard. And with that, we are excited that conference is coming up in a couple weeks, and I hope that we'll see you all there. And that's it. I hope you guys have a great day.